The first letter came on a Thursday morning. I was sipping tea by the window when I noticed the paper wedged under the doormat, bold red ink and an official seal from the Willow Creek Estates HOA. It wasn't a welcome note. It was a fine, $150 for planting non-compliant vegetation in my front yard. The marigolds, bright and cheerful, were apparently too bold for the neighborhood's muted aesthetic policy. At first, I laughed. Then I realized it wasn't a joke that I had only been in this house for 2 weeks. After losing my husband, Ethan insisted I move closer to him. The house was his gift, a quiet, modest home with space to breathe and grieve. The marigolds reminded me of my childhood, and maybe that was too sentimental, but I didn't think I needed permission to plant flowers in my own soil. I called the HOA office expecting a reasonable conversation. What I got was Tanya Greer, the HOA president, delivering lines like she was a warden and I was already on parole. "You should have reviewed the HOA bylaws before altering your landscaping," she said. Her voice was precise, rehearsed, devoid of warmth. I explained I was new, that I hadn't even unpacked everything yet, that it was just a few flowers. But rules were rules, and as she put it, setting a precedent would be dangerous. She didn't explain dangerous for whom. The following week, a second notice came. Wind chimes. Noise pollution, they claimed. The chimes were barely audible inside the house, soft enough that even birds didn't seem to notice. Then came a letter about my mailbox being too tall by half an inch. Each letter carried a new penalty, a fresh warning. It was relentless, mechanical. The sort of pressure designed not to correct, but to break. When I brought it up to Ethan, he listened quietly, nodding at all the right moments. Then he asked me to send him copies of everything. I did. He didn't say much, but he didn't need to. I'd seen that look on his face before, when he was building a case, when he knew something smelled wrong and planned to find out just how deep the rot went. The notices didn't stop. One morning, I looked out the window and saw Tanya and 4 other HOA members standing in my yard, holding clipboards, taking photographs. No courtesy, no warning. I stepped outside and asked what they were doing. Tanya didn't even look up. "Routine inspection," she said, scribbling something in her binder. "For what?" I asked. "There's nothing out of order." "You're a bird feeder," she replied without hesitation. "It's attracting squirrels. That's a violation of Wildlife Policy 7.2. I wanted to scream. It was absurd. A bird feeder? Next, they'd say my lawn was too green. But it wasn't about rules. It never was. It was control. Tanya and her board wielded the HOA like a personal army, weaponizing technicalities to suppress anyone who didn't conform to their perfect, plastic vision of suburbia. That night, I found my trash bins knocked over. Another evening, a landscaping crew arrived to trim hedges I hadn't asked them to touch. I told them to leave, but they insisted they had a work order signed by the HOA. The intimidation was becoming physical. Ethan told me to start documenting everything, photos, videos, even audio if I could. He sounded less like my son and more like an attorney building a case file. Because that's what he was. 2 weeks later, Tanya came to my door with a police officer. She claimed I had made threatening remarks to HOA members. I was stunned. I hadn't raised my voice to anyone. The officer said this was a warning, and if there were further complaints, legal action could follow. That was the final push. Ethan was already at my house when it happened. He stepped forward, introduced himself with his full title, Federal Prosecutor, Department of Justice. Badge in hand, calm and measured. He explained, with quiet intensity, that every interaction was documented. That he had recordings. That if Tanya continued her pattern of harassment, it wouldn't be handled by the HOA, it would be handled in court. Tanya's demeanor shifted instantly. The smug authority vanished. The officer looked between us and left shortly after. Ethan wasn't bluffing. He'd already filed a complaint with the state attorney general's office. He had pulled financials, policies, and enforcement records. He had found patterns, targeted fines, discriminatory enforcement, misuse of authority. The storm had already begun, and Tanya had no idea just how far it would go. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He had something far more powerful than intimidation: the truth, the law, and the will to use both. And I, finally, had someone who wasn't just listening, but fighting back. By the time the police warning came and went, the mood around the neighborhood began to shift. Neighbors who once gave polite smiles now avoided eye contact. Some had probably received their own letters in the past and had learned to keep their heads down. But Ethan was just getting started. He wasn't acting as a son anymore. He had shifted into the mindset of a federal prosecutor with a target. Within days, he pulled property records, HOA bylaws, and archived meeting minutes. What he found was disturbing. Many of the so-called violations people were fined for weren't explicitly stated in the community's governing documents. Worse, some of the policies Tanya referenced didn't exist at all. She'd fabricated them, written them into her notices like gospel. Ethan also discovered that a select few homes, mostly those of Tanya's close friends, had never received a single violation, even though their properties broke several rules the rest of us were fined for. It was a clear pattern: selective enforcement, bordering on discriminatory conduct. That he compiled a timeline of every letter I had received, each phone call, and all photos of their inspections. He also found a clause buried in the HOA's founding charter requiring the board to notify residents before performing inspections or sending third-party vendors onto private property. That clause had been ignored for years. More troubling was the financial trail. Ethan requested annual financial reports, which the HOA was legally required to provide. After multiple ignored requests, he filed a formal records request through the state's Homeowner Protection Division. That pressure forced them to release documents within 10 days. When we received the records, they confirmed Ethan's suspicion. Thousands of dollars marked as maintenance services were funneled into vague vendor accounts that linked back to Tanya's personal property address. Landscapers had been paid for work at her home, not community spaces. Security systems billed to the HOA had been installed only at her property. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was misappropriation of funds. Possibly fraud. Armed with facts, Ethan escalated the case. He submitted a complaint to the state attorney general and also notified the county's fraud division. At the same time, he began contacting other residents, carefully and respectfully. Many were hesitant, but once they saw how organized the evidence was, some began speaking up. One older couple, the Walkers, had been fined repeatedly for having a small flag in their flower bed. They still had every notice, every check they had written. A single mother down the street had been threatened with lien action over a missing shingle that had already been repaired. Ethan documented every case. News of Ethan's actions reached Tanya quickly. That's when she began showing up again, this time not with clipboards, but with vague apologies and empty attempts to de-escalate. She sent a letter offering to waive my previous fines if I agreed to discontinue legal activity. Ethan took that letter straight to the state bar and filed a report. Intimidation in exchange for silence wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. By now, multiple agencies were watching. Tanya called for an emergency HOA board meeting, but Ethan had already requested that the state send an observer. The meeting was tense. Ethan didn't speak much, he didn't have to. His presence was enough. He had submitted all findings ahead of time, including proof of financial discrepancies and evidence that key HOA decisions were made without proper board votes. Even board members loyal to Tanya began to distance themselves from her, claiming they were unaware of the details. The state observer called for a review of all fines issued in the past 12 months and advised an audit of the HOA's financial management. Tanya pushed back, but it was no longer her stage. Her voice didn't carry the same weight, and the fear she had once instilled in everyone had started to erode. People realized she wasn't untouchable. Within a week, subpoenas were issued. Tanya received one, and so did her treasurer and 2 longtime board allies. They were instructed to produce records, emails, and receipts. Ethan was contacted by the Attorney General's office and asked to provide testimony on behalf of the residents. He agreed. The investigation was now officially under review, and Tanya's empire was crumbling. That I wasn't the only one who noticed the change. Neighbors started approaching me, quiet at first, then more openly. They thanked me. Not for planting flowers, but for standing firm. For letting Ethan dig. Some had been afraid to fight back for years, resigned to the system. But now, they saw that the system could break when someone knew how to pull the right threads. Ethan wasn't finished. He filed a civil complaint for damages on my behalf, including emotional distress and trespassing. The state had enough to begin drafting charges, and Tanya, once the untouchable face of control in the neighborhood, was now under a very different spotlight. One where power meant accountability. Once the investigation became public knowledge, the dynamic within Willow Creek Estates flipped overnight. What was once silent fear turned into cautious optimism. Residents who had once cowered under Tanya's authority began quietly organizing. They started asking questions, not just about fines or violations, but about the very structure of their HOA, the legality of the rules enforced, and the legitimacy of the people making those decisions. For the first time in years, the boardroom at the clubhouse filled up with more than just the usual cronies. And Ethan made sure every one of them knew their rights. The mounting pressure forced Tanya to step back from day-to-day operations. She claimed it was to cooperate fully with the investigation, but everyone knew it wasn't voluntary. The state had already sent financial auditors, and their early findings were damning. Thousands in HOA funds were unaccounted for. Contracts had been issued without bids. Work orders were falsified. Tanya and her allies had created a system of shadow authority, using policy as a weapon and community money as a personal resource. With Tanya sidelined, interim leadership was appointed. This new board, under the state's supervision, suspended all pending fines and began issuing refunds. For many residents, the money wasn't much, but the gesture meant everything. It was an official admission that something had gone very wrong, and that it could be made right. Ethan wasn't satisfied with apologies and reimbursements. He knew the root of the rot wasn't just corruption, but the silence that let it fester. So, he pushed for structural reform. He drafted amendments to the HOA bylaws, introducing transparency requirements, term limits, and mandatory financial reporting. These proposals were presented at a special election meeting, and though Tanya's loyalists tried to stall the vote, they were overruled. Residents passed the reforms with an overwhelming majority. The board, once a private club for Tanya's circle, would now be elected democratically with open accountability. It wasn't just about removing a corrupt leader. It was about ensuring no one else could ever build that kind of unchecked power again. Despite the changes, Tanya wasn't finished trying to save herself. She hired an attorney, released a public letter claiming she had only acted in the community's best interest, and tried to paint herself as the victim of political sabotage. But Ethan was ready for every move. He released a timeline showing how Tanya had created unapproved rules, issued false citations, and used HOA funds for personal home upgrades. The contrast between her words and the documented truth was undeniable. The state's investigation reached its conclusion after 3 months. Tanya was formally charged with misappropriation of funds, abuse of power, and falsifying official records. Her treasurer faced similar charges. The court set dates, and subpoenas turned into depositions. Ethan didn't stop at the criminal side. He encouraged residents who had been financially or emotionally harmed by Tanya's actions to join a class action lawsuit. Dozens signed on. As the legal wheels turned, my own home finally began to feel like a place of peace. No more notices. No more inspections. I replanted the marigolds without fear. The bird feeder stayed where it was. People waved again. Some stopped to chat. The change wasn't just in the bylaws, it was in the air. Ethan visited often, and every time he walked through the neighborhood, people approached him. They thanked him not for being a prosecutor, but for being someone who didn't flinch when power pushed back. He reminded them that even in the smallest of battles, truth and persistence could tilt the balance. He didn't care about recognition. He cared that no one else would have to go through what I did. The final blow came when the HOA's insurance refused to cover Tanya's legal defense, stating her actions were outside the scope of her duties. She was left to pay her own legal fees, facing multiple lawsuits and mounting public disgrace. Her house went on the market within weeks. She moved out quietly, no announcement, no farewell. In her place, new board members, regular residents with no personal agenda, took the reins. They opened budgets to public view, held open Q&A sessions, and created a real channel for communication. What had once been a system of silence and surveillance had transformed into something it was always supposed to be, a community. Ethan never asked for thanks. But one evening, after dinner, he handed me a folder. Inside were copies of every complaint he had filed, every piece of evidence gathered, and the official letter from the state confirming the new oversight plan for Willow Creek Estates. On top was a note, for when they ask how it changed. So they never forget. The courtroom was quiet when Tanya finally stood before the judge. No more clipboard, no polished smile, no power left to manipulate with policy. She pled no contest to the charges. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, fabricated notices, misused funds, and resident testimonies too consistent to ignore. The sentence included fines, probation, and a mandatory restitution payment to the HOA. But the real punishment wasn't legal. It was the complete erasure of her control. Her reputation, once carefully cultivated among neighboring communities and local committees, was now nothing but a cautionary tale Ethan didn't celebrate. He said it wasn't about taking someone down, it was about restoring balance. About making sure people like Tanya couldn't hide behind titles to bully others into silence. The class action lawsuit moved forward next. With over 30 residents involved, the civil court awarded collective damages for financial penalties wrongfully charged, stress-induced medical expenses, and property invasion. For many, this money covered bills they'd struggled with for years due to Tanya's targeted fines. The funds were just one piece. What mattered more was the restoration of dignity. One couple, the Walkers, said they finally felt like their home belonged to them again. Another resident, a single mother who'd faced repeated threats over minor yard violations, told the court she could finally sleep at night. And in the middle of it all was Ethan, not as a savior, but as a facilitator. He empowered them to speak up, to act, to believe they deserved better. He was never loud about it, never seeking attention, just methodical, persistent, and exact. The new HOA board, energized by the reforms Ethan introduced, passed additional policies protecting residents from arbitrary enforcement. They created a formal grievance process, required board members to undergo ethics training, and established a rotating audit committee made up of volunteers. No longer a fortress of secrecy, the HOA transformed into a transparent and fair organization. Meetings were recorded and made available online. Votes were tracked, and decisions required resident input. It was the kind of neighborhood leadership model that other communities started reaching out to replicate. Months passed, and peace became the norm rather than the exception. The tension that had wrapped the neighborhood like a vice slowly dissolved. People began working together, helping each other with home repairs, organizing garden clubs, and attending community movie nights that had once been blocked for being too disruptive. It was a subtle transformation, but profound. The fear had been replaced with trust, not because the threat vanished, but because the residents reclaimed their power. I watched all of it unfold from my porch, the same porch where Tanya had once stood uninvited with threats and ultimatums. Now, children played outside without whispered warnings about being too loud. Lawns were diverse, full of life, not trimmed into silent conformity. Flags waved, wind chimes rang, and my marigolds bloomed proudly without consequence. Every day, I woke up to the sound of normalcy, not fear. The battle, though exhausting, had created something stronger than safety. It created unity. Ethan eventually returned to his regular work, but part of him stayed here. His blueprint for change had rooted itself in every home that once felt isolated. He made sure I had everything I needed, from legal documents to digital backups, and he introduced me to a few members of the new board he trusted. But most importantly, he gave me my voice back. The one Tanya had tried to crush under paperwork and threats. I began attending meetings, not because I wanted power, but because I finally believed I had a right to be heard. I wasn't the only one. The turnout at every meeting grew, and the community started electing people based on trust, not familiarity. There was no appetite for control anymore, just a shared understanding that what happened before would never be allowed again. When the anniversary of the reform vote arrived, the board hosted a neighborhood dinner. No speeches, no fanfare. Just neighbors gathering without fear. That evening, Ethan surprised me by flying in. He didn't stay long, just enough to check in, see the changes for himself, and smile at what he helped create. Before he left, he leaned in and said, "You never needed me to fight for you. You just needed space to remember how strong you already were." As the sun set that night, I looked around and saw not a battleground, but a home. Not just mine, but everyone's. The kind built not from perfect lawns or matching fences, but from resilience, truth, and the unshakable belief that even in the face of tyranny, justice can, and will, prevail.